Hi guys! I thought I would do a quick look at the Labour Manifesto, which was released today. And this is another audio. I'm sorry, I do fully intend to do some more videos shortly, but for the moment this is kind of suiting me. So as you all know from listening to my podcasts and my videos, that I am not exactly ideologically inclined to vote for Labour. However, at the moment I feel the Conservatives as well are not living up to their name of being conservative. And I don't feel they are being fiscally conservative either. I feel that the Conservatives also are caught in a metropolitan bubble elite. They listen too much to the BBC and they were being drawn too far in a progressive direction. But let's have a look at some of the things that I think about this Labour manifesto. I see that it is mainly aimed at public service workers, as at the youth, and I don't see a lot of policies particularly aimed at their working class base. And when I look at these policies, I can see through them more the direction Labour are headed in terms of who they see their voters of the future being. And it's definitely not the classic white working class in a certain northeast and northwest of the country. So when they talk about their public pay sector rise, of course, that helps anyone who works in the public sector. I see very little in here for people who are self-employed, for entrepreneurs, and for small business owners. Haven't they always said that England is a nation of shop owners? I think it's not just so much shop owners, but we are a nation of small businesses. There's nothing in here for the small business person. So we must continue to subsidize the pay rise, the 4-day week, and the pensions of a growing number of public sector workers. When the public sector does not contribute to the economic productivity, it's not a wealth creating sector. And so while that's great for those people that they're getting a pay rise, that absolutely doesn't do anything for those of us who are in the private sector. Many of us self-employed have to work 7 days a week. We don't have any of the job security that they would have, but they are getting another pay rise. So that is I would say is a policy that benefits people who are likely to vote for the Labour Party, and that includes teachers, people probably in the public sector, in the NHS, in the civil service. They're more likely to vote Labour and therefore they're getting their pay increase. So I see they're getting rid of the married person's allowance, but I remember when David Cameron introduced that, that's a rather small amount of money. Next thing is they're aiming with lowering the voting age to 16 and free tuition fees. They are massively trying to attract the votes of younger people. I feel this is almost a cynical ploy to get all the youngsters voting for them. I think with tuition fees, that doesn't, a lot of working class people might think, well, why do I have to fund the fees of people who are going on to university who can potentially be much higher earners in the future? I strongly believe people should contribute to their own education primarily, and I think the tuition fees have done a wonderful thing because people are now more likely to enter the sciences, the engineering, and the more challenging degrees which will offer bigger pay in the future and which our economy really needs. I felt when I went to university I had to pay because I wasn't hadn't been living in Britain at the time. A lot of people were going for free at the time, and I think that they used the experience to have fun, weren't really focused on studies, and weren't really choosing degrees that was going to give them a good career prospect ahead. And I felt people shied away from the tougher degrees, and when they know they've got to pay for it, they know that they've got to be able to earn to pay for it. And I felt it has stimulated the economy in terms of more people studying for those important degrees. However, I also want to say, if people are going to go to university for free, that means universities will rely on government for funding. They probably won't get enough funding from government. Therefore, they'll have to take on more and more foreign students who do pay extortionate fees, which means there'll be fewer places for British students, and far more places will be allocated to foreign students, which means we're not going to be producing enough talent or nurturing talent in this country, which we are already not doing, because in the NHS, I think, well, not the NHS, but in terms of medical students, there were 12,000 students who had the grades in order to go to medical school but weren't given university places. So we seem to want to import people to be our doctors, not to train our own. It's the same with nurses, and I think that's a big problem. It will only be made worse, actually, by free university. I do see a cause for giving reduced rates at university for people going into things like medicine, which requires 7 years. That to me would make sense. Right, extending the franchise to 16-year-olds. Obviously, 16-year-olds have just come out of an education system which is really geared to be left-wing. We could use the word brainwashing. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. They want to extend the franchise to anyone who lives in the country. You don't have to be a citizen. You could have come here on day one and you would be allowed to vote. I'm not even sure if there is a requirement that you would be working. I think this clearly shows that in the future, Labour see all their votes coming from immigrants, and it's another example of how they are ditching their classic working class voters, especially in the north of the country. It just shows that their policies are aimed at mass immigration, and that's where they ideologically can see their votes coming from. Maybe it's a admission of failure in a way. It's like we can't get our traditional vote out to vote for us anymore. So we've got to rely on youngsters who will vote on rather spurious policies like green policies and free tuition fees. And we've got to rely on people who've just come into the country to vote, because obviously Labour are very ideologically not ideologically. I want to say that Labour rely very much on identity politics to get their votes. So they sell themselves on an identity politics basis. Therefore, immigrants will always be more likely to vote for Labour. And since most 16-year-olds will now, I'd say 30% of 16-year-olds, 20 to 30% will be from an immigrant background. And because of identity politics, it also means that young people are now going to be far more likely to vote for Labour. As I said, there's nothing for self-employed, there's nothing from entrepreneurs, nothing for small and medium-sized businesses. I also think the increase in extending the franchise to 16-year-olds and to people who've just come into the country, it's a way of gerrymandering not only future elections but a future referendum. Because if we do have another referendum on Europe and all EU citizens are allowed to vote, it's quite obvious that we're going to get a vote for Remain. So it is a way of ensuring, basically, that we get a Remain vote and stay in the European Union. So let's have a look at corporation tax. Okay, they want to extend it from 19% up to 26%. Study after study has shown that the more you increase corporation tax, the less the take is, and that's because companies are highly mobile, and the most successful wealthy people are highly mobile and can move their money elsewhere. The Irish economic miracle of 2015 shows that when you reduce corporation tax, you attract more companies, you create jobs, and I'm sure all of us have got friends living in Ireland, and we've seen what it's done for that country and for the prosperity. I don't believe that's a policy that's going to increase the tax take. I think it'll only damage business further, and those corporation tax hikes will have to be passed on by increases in prices, decreases in wages, and less research and development and less investment going forward, which can only damage, infrastructure changes and further inhibit the economy. I don't think that'll do anything to stimulate productivity or demand. Now, a lot of people are saying the whole nationalisations are not costed. In terms of the 4-day week, I feel this is harking to Marx's theory, which is that exchanging your service or exchanging your hours or working for money is a form of exploitation. So I think it's a nod to Marx's theory. I also think that what we're going to do with a 4-day week, so how would you force, obviously in all their nationalised industries and in all public sector, we only have a 4-day week because the government can enforce that. But we already have doctor shortages, nurse shortages, skill shortages. Surely that will make all those shortages worse, which will lead to more and more immigration in order to fill the vacancies that will arise if people are only working 4 days a week. Not all skills are transferable, so sometimes if the skills are highly specialised, like with doctors, I really don't see how they'd account for the shortfall in hours. They want to build all these homes, 150,000 homes every year. But if you're only going to be working a 4-day week, how can that be achieved? Again, there'll have to be a huge influx of builders and people who can work on the construction sites. Also, I see, how would you force private companies to do a 4-day week, from the big accounting firms to even your supermarkets? Because it's going to result in a loss for them. And at a time when the high street is struggling and we have Marks, Sainsbury's, Next, all these stores battling, if they're forced to pay people a full 5 days and only employ them 4 days and have to take on more staff to feed the shortfall, I don't see how that's going to help profitability for our high street. And it can only lead to more store closures and more problems on high street. I'm not quite sure how you would enforce that. And for all very nationalised industries, surely it would lead to a great fall in kind of service levels if people are only working a 4-day week and that gap has to be plugged. Then we also haven't factored in the effect on institutional investors and pension funds of nationalising these industries. I'm going to come back to nationalisation briefly, but talking about BT, I mean, when BT were run by the government, sometimes it took 3 weeks for you to get a phone installed, or even more. And I wouldn't say I'm the greatest fan of the fact that all these industries have been privatised, because I do think excessive profits are being made. But I think there's an argument to be made that now it's done, it would be very hard to turn the clock back, and it could possibly do more damage to turn the clock back. I also constantly am told that with the being in the EU, which we are highly likely to remain with Labour, I cannot see us leaving with Labour at all, because of course with the gerrymandering of the second referendum, we wouldn't leave. And that means we also lose the rebate that we got under Margaret Thatcher, which means our contributions would go far higher, which means even less money in the kitty. But, you know, with the private nationalisation, I know that in France and in Germany, they do have industries that are nationalised, but I don't know how that works with state aid. With the state aid rules, wouldn't it really be hard to turn a privatised company into a nationalised? Wouldn't EDF and E.ON, the German and French electricity suppliers, be able to say something about that in terms of taking it to the European court? I really don't think that's a fully thought out policy, especially how it would relate to us still being in the EU. The government also want to get rid of a 4 million grant for research and development. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. If we're not encouraging businesses to innovate, that's extremely short-sighted, because surely research and development is one of the key ways to keep our economy moving forward and to stay as one of the top economies of the world, rather than just being a kind of banana republic. He wants to introduce a £10 minimum wage. Okay, that's great, but the costs of that are going to be passed on. I think they could further damage the retail sector as well, where most people who do work in retail are on lower wages. Of course, it would be nice for them to have higher wages, but as I say, it's going to be passed on via higher costs and possibly even redundancy, so I don't see how that would actually be a net gain. As far as zero-hour contracts in the gig economy, a lot of people want to be on 0 hours contracts. I know they're not ideal. They are a form of exploitation, but they do increase flexibility in certain sectors where that's needed, and it could damage those sectors, and there might be further loss of work. So while it's not ideal to have a 0 hours contract, sometimes it's better than nothing. Apparently the cost of nationalisation hasn't even been included. Just going back for a moment, and thanks to Paul Keane for mentioning this, but in terms of tax rises for higher earners over 80,000, a lot of consultants that work in the NHS are on kind of 10,000, but as soon as you 100,000, should I say? But as soon as you earn over 100,000, you lose your personal allowance, or you begin to lose it incrementally, and it becomes you begin to be taxed on further pension contributions. So it gets to the point where consultants are working a certain amount of hours effectively for nothing, which means more and more consultants at a higher grade are retiring or moving out of the NHS into private, which is also a net loss. So often these tax hikes sound great if you don't think about them clearly. The rich are going to pay more. Great. We shouldn't write out the rich as being contributors to our economy and contributors to the functioning of the country in many ways. So we don't want to almost demonize that sector of society, especially when they are the consultants and the people in the hospitals that are very, very important. So another big concern of mine with nationalisation is right now private companies run on profit and loss. And yes, I do think some of the rewards for senior management are exorbitant. However, efficiency is key in their running. However, I feel the more the Labour government nationalise and take over industries, the more the industries will stop running efficiently, and they'll be run along ideological lines. They will be run in order to push progressive agendas. There'll be all sorts of quotas. It won't be about merit, it'll be about ticking boxes, and they will push all the progressive ideas which a lot of us are highly skeptical about it. So it'll become a form of social engineering via these public sector. Well, the public sector is going to grow and grow and grow, and therefore there'll be more social engineering, more common purpose style tactics within that to drive a progressive agenda socially. So Yes, and as it is with the EU as well, we have so many workers coming in working at low pay. We are effectively subsidizing low paid jobs via tax credits. So we're already subsidizing the biggest companies anyway, and I don't see that Labour also going to move to address any of that. Although that probably isn't Labour's fault that I can blame that for. Yeah, so we talked about the under 16s, of course, children having a vote. Yeah, so those are some of my thoughts on the Labour Manifesto and why I think there's some problem areas there. I do feel one thing that the Labour are doing, which is definitely cutting through on the electorate, and probably a lot more of you are seeing it on Facebook. It's this thing of, we've got to save our NHS. Have you seen the Facebook meme going around? It's some story about an American woman who's moved here saying, oh, you must preserve your NHS. The last thing you want is an American-style system. And I think Labour are pushing the narrative that if we leave the Tories in charge, that our NHS will be lost and will become like an American-style system. And I think that's a fabrication. If we leave it in Labour's hands with mass immigration, which we will basically need because of the 4-day working week and all the initiatives enclosed in the manifesto, we will need mass immigration. They're very for mass immigration, which means that no matter how many houses we build and how much we fund the NHS, we're not going to be able to keep up. Because at the moment, it's high enough with an extra 1 million people every 3 years, which requires basically the infrastructure of Birmingham to be able to cope with. So I don't think, for me, it's going to be not controlling immigration and the NHS being overburdened that it's going to lead to its demise, rather than leaving it in the hands of the Tories. And I feel that a certain amount of outsourcing is going to be needed to keep it going. But certainly narratives to do with the NHS becoming Americanized are cutting through and are providing quite important tactic for Labour in this election. So as I said, I've got my election prediction coming up. Plus, I'm going to be looking at some constituencies and seeing which ways they might go. So I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks, guys, and hope to speak to you soon.